Welcome to the lecture on globals. We have 7 minutes to do this, which should be absolutely plenty because it's, again, 2 slides. But global variables are bad. We learned that in 1511. That doesn't really not be true. That's always true, right? They're bad. However, for the sake of your project, they're very useful to get you started without teaching you more complex things about Python or data. And the reason is because up until this point, you haven't had to really store data in your programming code, right? Like you think about 1511 and stuff, you haven't really had to store lots of complex data. And it's hard to store data. So this is kind of like the quick and hacky and dirty version of doing that. And the way it works in Python is kind of a bit weird, but this is something I have in Python here. And the way global variables work in Python is that you can define them if they're defined in like the global scope, right? Which is the same thing as C, which is not inside any functions. They're in the global scope. Now, the way that Python works is that if I call print something here, the function, this will function successfully. Because in Python, all global variables are readable by functions by default. So if you just define my variable in the global scope, any function that uses that name, assuming there's no name conflicts, will just print it out for you, right? It's all accessible. One of the things in Python, though, is that if you try and modify a global variable, right? Notice how I write something bad. It takes the global variable 5 and it tries to set it to be 6. So I'm going to print the global variable, I'm going to try and modify it, and then I'm going to try and print it again. And you'll see the results are startling, right? Not really. And the results are basically that by default, the way Python works is that it doesn't let you modify a global variable. Now, the reason for that, in a nutshell, is because when you use a global variable inside a function, I'll show you what happens. So I'm going to use an f string. My variable internal 1, as in like this is the, I'll just call this internal 1, is that, and then I'll copy and paste that line. Error. Why is that not working? Why did that one work? Oh, okay. I think I learned something about Python just then. Okay, so here's what happens. I guess I've never actually done this example this way, but so now I'm confused. But the short story is that by setting that value inside this function, I'm pretty sure I've basically said to Python that I actually want you to use my variable as a local function variable, not as a global variable. So you'll notice here that you would expect both this printout here to be 6 and this print something to be 6 because we've modified the global variable. But in actual fact, you'll see that when I print out my variable here, it is 6, but when we try and print it out after that fact, it's 5 again. So the reason here is not that it reverts to being 5, like it's not that like it was 5 and then we changed it to 6 and then it's gone back to 5. What actually happens here is that when you use a global variable inside your function, when you mutate it, when you modify it, it actually kind of creates a local variable instead. So this my variable inside the function here is a local variable, right? Like Python is like, I'm not going to modify a global variable, so here is I'm just going to make this a local variable. So this is actually set to 6, and this is actually printed out successfully as 6, but this is not the same as the global variable. So short story, you can read global variables from any function, you can't write to global variables. How you write to global variables, though, is if at the top of your function, you just create a global variable, right, like this. You do use the global keyword. This is a way of saying to Python, I know this is a global variable, I want it to be modifiable, like that. And now it's actually modified. So the global keyword at the top of a function is what makes that global variable modifiable within a function. It's I don't want to equate it too much to the pass by value then reference thing, because I think that's a bit tricky. Global variables are not like hash defines in C, sadly. They're pretty much just global variables. Like in C, you can actually have global variables too. Like you can just define int up here like that. That's possible in C. So Yuval gets to the crux of this, which is the last bit of this lecture, which is the second slide of this 2-slide lecture, which is, but in the project, you recommend data global structure to store info like new user and channels data. If we can't modify it, then how will we add and delete from it? So you can modify it. Oh, sorry, someone's asked another question. What happens if you use it after line 11? Well, I did. I printed it here. So, if I just said like print my variable, it would print 6 because I modified it. So here's the thing about your project, right? And if we just jump back to a second to was it week 2 backend? So in your project, and this is the last few minutes, I know we're going to run till like 2:02 or something. We're not going to be doing classes in this course because it's too much work. I know that sounds kind of dumb for people who know it, but this course is already a lot for students to take in. So trying to teach object-oriented principles as a standard is like a whole other thing, you know. And you can do that, by the way. If you know more about Python, go ahead. The point is like to satisfy the objectives and learning outcomes of this course, we don't need to teach object-oriented programming, even though it would, yes, be a better way of doing it. So what many of you will actually want to do in your project is whenever you like create a user or create a channel or like read from a channel and stuff, you're probably going to actually need to store data somewhere. So what most of you are probably going to do is you're probably going to create a file called like data.py or store.py or info.py, and inside of that you'll actually start creating maybe, and there's a few different ways to do it, I'm just giving you one of them. You might create some dictionaries, right? Like a user's dictionary and a channel's dictionary and a channel dictionary, and a messages dictionary, or maybe you'll have more than that, or maybe you'll just have one, or maybe you'll just have lists. Like it's totally up to your group. I'm not trying to prime you too much. But what you'll do is you'll have that in data.py, and then when you want to use it in your other functions like auth.py, you'll say from, how do we import again? I forget, we changed it this term. Yeah, from source.data import users or something like this. Right, so you have your kind of data structure in another file, and we're going to talk about importing tomorrow. Okay, so if this is a bit scary, that's okay. And when you actually create a user, you'll actually be doing something like users.append or like users email equals something, right? And again, I'm trying not to be too explicit because it's for you to figure out, but the point is that the global variable approach, or storing all of your data in just variables, it is kind of, you know, the easiest way to do it is to basically create a file or a series of files and just store these things as lists and dictionaries, and then access them in different things. Because in your channels file, you're probably going to need to access the users. In your channel file, you're probably going to need to access the user. So there's this broad sense of like storing your data in one place, basically. But this will make more sense as you, you know, move through it more. Lists and dictionaries is where you store everything, and you can store it all in one file, and you can import that single file. But yeah, just to come back to that, yes, you should, yes, depending on how you're doing this, you sometimes might need to use global. It depends how you're doing it. There's a lot here to it and stuff. It's just like, the point of this lecture is not to go through like a big step-by-step thing on like how to do every part of it. It's more like you're all going to run into problems where you ask yourself, how the hell are we going to store this data? And the answer is you can store it in a file and import variables from that file. And we'll talk about this more when we do importing tomorrow. And to answer that question again about object-oriented programming and stuff, it's just like, why don't we teach SQL in this course? Why don't we teach front-end web development? They'd all be cool and useful things, but too many courses in CSE try and do too much. Some courses in CSE try and do too much in one course anyway. So you only need to use the global keyword if you're modifying things. But I know you got a lot of questions. My answer to most of your questions is go try it out. You all have computers. You all have the ability to test this stuff out. So go and make it. See if it works. If it doesn't work, have it, poke around, change some stuff. And if you still don't know, just post on the forum and we'll help you out. So anyway, it's 2:03, so we're going to stop right here. If you have any following questions, just post on the forum. And other than that, before you go, oh, damn it. Anyone who wants to hang around for just a couple of minutes, you can all... Actually, I'll stop the recording. Bye, everyone who's watching the recording.